Helen and Philip, thanks so much for taking some time out to help us think about these stories. The first section on eco-justice issues. I know as you answer, you're speaking from your own context, but you've also got an element of oversight in this area. So Philip with tier funds and looking at international relations and how Christians relate to some of the global structures. And it's great because you're from the global south, from India. So I think that's going to come through in some of the stories, the need to listen to not just the local, but the global picture. And Helen, right at the start of Extinction Rebellion, a parish priest yourself, but working within Christians for Climate Action and groups like that, and at the cutting edge of the kind of protesting prophetic movement of the church in this area. That's how I got to know you, through following you on Facebook and seeing you at so many protests as a Church of England vicar. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to plough in straight away. You've read the stories. Thanks so much for doing that. What was your first response to them in terms of, are these stories of encouragement? Are these stories of challenge? Helen, would you kick us off? Where did you go first in your mind as you read them?
I think for me, what came across in all three of them was the materiality of climate change. There's this contrast between the material and a deep engagement with the material in all three, but also, so in one of the stories, it's referred to as a silent threat. Well, it's less and less silent, but that got me thinking about, obviously of a sort of resonance with Silent Spring, and Rachel Carson's work, that when things are invisible, they're more difficult to grapple with, and yet these stories were very much about material things, about objects, about soil, about water. So that was what came across to me most powerfully across all three, I think, and that led me to thinking about the voiceless, in this particular instance being the non-human. I think that was my overarching sense from all three.
When I read those three stories, what struck me was that it filled my heart with a sense of hope. The fact that we have a person like Laura and the other contributors as well, who are verbalizing their journeys, how that connects to faith, that actually this is not, when I say hope, I don't mean optimism, because you read the chapters and you see how bad things are and how little is being done to address it. But I'm talking about hope in that more theological sense, hope that actually is birthed when optimism dies. And there's something in our sort of modern era that has made us people who believe we can solve this. We can somehow find technology that's going to solve the problem. And so therefore, it was hope that came, hope that is, that theological hope. And the second thing I would say that struck me was that true kind of hope, because, the word hope is used in all sorts of ways, but that kind of, crucified and risen hope makes us, it disempowers the lie that this is the last chapter in the story. It makes us take action, some kind of action, a little action. Somebody called, it's sort of microaggression against the system. It's a micro revolution in the moment. When you see a seed become a plant, you are following the grain of how God made this universe. And you believe that Jesus has confirmed for us that life will triumph over death, even though this kind of discourse can be co-opted to kind of give us some false comfort of optimism. I think we look at reality in the face, but I came away with a sense that it inspired hope in me. So I'll stop there. Yeah.
If I speak to my own experience of having been with the group of non-Christians, in particular with Extinction Rebellion, where something bubbled up here in Dorking because we'd had a fracking site, we'd had a camp there. So, speaking very much from the practical, on the doorstep threat, that meant that there were people already ready to launch themselves into the work of Extinction Rebellion when that first became something out of the action networks. And there was the huge joy, and for me, that Easter Rebellion was a risen moment. It was a kingdom moment, hugely, where we lived together cooperatively. We collaborated in completely new ways. We ignored the hierarchies of normal society, and that was, you know, for me, that was God's kingdom happening in Marble Arch, with an enormous range of people. Each of them had that hope in their hearts. Now, obviously, that was 2019, and we're 2023, and all sorts of things have happened. But with that same small group from here in Southeast Surrey, we're now talking about how to purchase common land and give it back to communities, how to lobby MPs, how to encourage people to think about the personal changes they can make. So it's become the local from this big sort of, and I suppose I do think of that as a risen moment. You have this extraordinary resurrection, you have this defining Jesus event in our lives, and then, you know, they all have to go off and live in little communities and share everything in common, and it's awful, and you get put in prison and people die, but they have hope in their hearts, which Philip so eloquently described. And there's a lot of talk in activism about hope as opposed to optimism. So not a false optimism, the sort of thing that the powers that be want to give us, to say, oh, we'll fix it. We're not going to fix it. We're going to have to think how we're going to live in it. Perspective. And can we take something from the queering of the world to look at how we might break through in the way that Jesus broke through the norms and present something different? That would be my hope.
I picked up on that. I thought it was really interesting that Kathy's journey kind of included her own kind of marginalisation. You know, from a marginal position, she could see how the world structures were working for harm. And there was a sense that sometimes you have to sort of step out of your everyday life. So, you know, yourself and Kathy making a pilgrimage to COP, or Kathy's time in Ghana, Laura's time at COP. You know, I think that there are times that you just need to step out, be a little marginal to maybe the ordinary workings of society, to see them clearly. Philip, I was going to ask you about that. Kathy starts her story in Ghana and seeing the connections between the acts of the West upon the climate of Africa in that situation. Are people making those connections? How do we help them to make those connections?
That's right. In her chapter, she talks about poverty, injustice, and climate crisis are all part of the same problem. So there's a sort of intersectional approach that she, you know, partly because of coming from a queer, marginalized perspective, she's able to make these connections more you know, even just being able to make these connections. So I think that's the first thing to be said. And she uses a very interesting phrase, in between worlds. And often part of being born into privilege, having some bit of wealth, but you're trying to sort of move to the margins, learn to see and live in the world differently, you're constantly caught in this sort of feeling of living in between worlds. You know, for me, especially growing up in India, coming to live in the UK here and having been here for 25 years now, you're in this in-between worlds. So I think coming to the question of the global south, a couple of things I think should need to be said. Kathy is right when she says climate change is a form of violence against the people of the global south. Part of what climate change is forcing us to deal with is to think of the world and engage with the world beyond the sort of state-centric approach that we've had. So once you start having to grapple with the question of the environment, this idea of the nation state begins to sort of get challenged. We need governance structures that go beyond the nation state. So that's one thing to say. The second thing is, and I'll try to be brief, the idea, I still think, you know, to really deal with the climate issue, we need to deal with capitalism. And I know there are other chapters in the book that are going to talk about this, but I think unless we question the economic system that we have put in place, and it's got a deep root to it, it didn't start after the Second World War, of prioritizing and primarily seeking quick return on capital, we have therefore allowed things like the environment, human relationships as collateral in this kind of economic system, and that needs to be challenged. This is the last thing, you know, the Western model, for all the good that it has brought in many areas, is also inadequate and has also been destructive. And I think we need to find a way to go past this place we find ourselves in, to think through governance beyond the nation state, allow for people to develop, but without it being at the cost of the environment. And finally, how do we draw on religious traditions that are not primarily talking about the environment in this other way? Even much of Christianity talks about creation as if it's another. I am creation. This body that I'm in has come from creation and will go back to creation. And it's so, even for me who's been grappling with this for 20 years, it's so quick to talk about creation as other, but no, we are creation. What happens in creation? And I think this is where other traditions that we might even label as being pantheistic might have some things to offer for us to help us live differently if we're going to have some kind of future. And I'll stop there.
Can I come back on that? I mean, not come back on it. I want to reinforce it, because I think, on a practical level, I find the language of the theology we use and the language of some of the liturgies that the Church of England use about stewardship and care for creation, it encourages that kind of duality between us and the rest. And to talk about the interconnectedness, I've been trying to find places where that happens within the Christian tradition, that that the interconnectedness that is so strongly spoken of in some of the pantheistic traditions. And inevitably one verges towards looking at the Celtic tradition and looking at some of those amazing Anglo-Saxon crosses that show all of creation feeding together on the Eucharistic feast. So I find in my own lived out ministry, I'm looking for new language to speak of the created world. And there are so many amazing initiatives, but they do still look at it as something we have to take care of. But it's got to go so deep. It's got to really penetrate deep down. It's a massive change in the way we live, and our society, I believe, is deeply sick at the moment, and that is a hope that in curing, in trying to return to an interconnectedness, we bring something back to life that I think is really missing, and we see it particularly in our young people.
Gosh, you've taken us to a fundamental and radical challenge there, both of you. I mean, you're not talking about lifestyle change. You're not talking about a better awareness of environmental impact. I mean, you've gone as far there, Philip, about questioning capitalism, seeking new language for theology, perhaps a different understanding, a different theology of creation. I mean, these are fundamentally huge challenges that you're seeing come from what's been written here. And yet I think as well there's a place for this. I like the story about the prophetic pivot of returning to the charity shop, being led by the Spirit to find, the one item that James is looking for. And I like the way he problematizes that. He's kind of aware that this sounds so strange to think the Holy Spirit has led him to a shelf in a charity shop. But for him, it's a pivotal moment. Can we encourage people to have those moments, or is that something that just happens beyond anything that we could kind of create culturally? Can we create moments of prophetic pivots for others, or are we waiting for them to happen? What do you think? Helen, are your protests attempting to create pivotal moments? I just wondered if you'd thought of them in that way.
I think that's right. I think taking Eucharist into the street, which is not something I'd ever imagined doing, but to celebrate the Eucharistic feast in Downing Street, in a place of power, to be there. I often think the ripple effect of people passing by and seeing that. And I do believe that these are ripple effects, that there might not be one prophetic pivot moment, but that we might slowly pivot somebody. When I talk about it, I realize that my most deeply prayerful moments of change for me have been in direct contact with the tarmac. And I talk about the treasure in the tarmac, that, you know, tarmac prevents us from touching the soil, but dropped to my knees on the tarmac alongside others is the nearest I'm going to get to connecting in a industrialized environment.
But can I just maybe make reference to two quick stories, and then I'm going to pull an object from my bag to talk about how this practically happens, because I think ultimately it's in those little steps that you begin to, the wind of the Spirit moves your direction of travel, or sort of redirects where you're going. I think two conversations. One was with a Baptist pastor here in Cambridge, and I was at an event in Berlin last year for Christian community development practitioners and people involved in the sort of development space, Christian involved in the development space. And we had a devotion in the morning. I don't even remember the passage in Luke that this person led the devotion on. And that day it was on creation care. And they just sent us out to go and sort of walk around in this Baptist church where the event was happening. And I just sort of walked around wanting to sort of, because they wanted you to look at nature and let God speak to you. Of course, in a big city like Berlin, you know, of course there are some trees, but you're not walking in nature, whatever nature is, you know. And I ended up picking up right near the fence where there was some cycles parked, this object. It's a plastic object. It was in mud. And probably some kid was playing with it and threw it. It's slightly broken as well. But I've kept this with me, and I take it out and again look at it, because one, it's made of plastic and the impact of plastic on our world. But the other reason I look at it often is this this lie that we are meant to be Superman. Who decided that that's what it means to be human? And for me, the pivot is to continually walk away from this and to say, for me, to be Christ-like is to reject this vision of what it means to be human, including the object, the material that's been used to make this object. And this is my experience of the Holy Spirit, because in picking up that object in Berlin, near a trash, where there was a lot of trash that was lying there, and I can see the trash that was there. How do I, both internally, but also how I live in the world, open myself up to the work of the Spirit? Because I'm more and more talking about a green pneumatology. You know, for those of us who study theology, these are sort of big words, but there is a sense of we need to see a global green Pentecostal awakening.
The way Josephine kind of popped in was exactly where I was in my head. It was just the most wonderful prompt, because Kathy talks about play, and play feels really important, that we need, you know, that's one of the spirit enhancing, energy giving things, that we've lost the capacity for play. You know, and if Jesus tells us to be like little children, I really believe that there is something that shifts in adulthood where we look at material objects as separate to us, not something we immerse ourselves in. And I know that there are practices where you pray with your hands in the big trough of soil, and you see adults just, you know, changing at that very moment. This isn't a slow thing. We worship outside twice a month in my church, and when we pause, we hear the birdsong. And when it's warm in the summer, not in our main service, but when we're outside doing Mossy Church, we lie and we look at the clouds. And those are the things that people remember, that reconnecting.
Partly because I think there's a connection between hope and play.
Yes, exactly.
Because despair robs you of the that sort of living out of the richness of who God is.
What would you say to those people, maybe some activists reading the book, who say, well, this is all just utterly depressing, the state of the situation, that the size of the problem, the global reach of the problem, the complete ineptitude of our leaders, this is very depressing. We are definitely battle worn, but how do we get the energy to actually affect structural change that really matters. How would you answer with that? Philip, I'll let you go first, and this is kind of your landing mark. So what's the message to people who actually do feel there's more reason to despair than to hope?
First of all, I think even in despair, there is something prophetic going on, because it's better than being indifferent, because there is an anguish of the soul. You know, Moltmann talks about God being the joy and anguish of his soul. There's some forms of despair is actually that, not the sort of Nietzschean kind of despair, but the kind of Christian despair, you know, that the anguish of the soul. So I think there is something to be, we need to honor that. When people feel that, it means that they are engaging in something that's brought them to that place. I think there's no formula for any of these things. You know, I think that the mechanistic idea that you can use some sort of technique to get to a place where you're not in despair, the only thing you do is to sort of fall on your face before the cross of Christ, and you do that in community. I think one thing I would say in all of this is find a group of people with whom you can be vulnerable, and they know you in your brokenness and want to still journey with you and believe that God has brought us into relationship, and we want to keep journeying together. So that's one, the community. I mean, the word community gets thrown around, but that sort of depth of relationship. When I say community, I mean depth of relationship. There is a sense in which I deeply believe God has not turned his back on this world. God has not abandoned his creation to the forces of evil and darkness and wickedness, and he hasn't sort of checked out. He's in the drama. He's somehow, you know, he's the one who has he says, the wounds of Christ are a sign that he is connected to this creation in a very fundamental way. And therefore that horizon of hope means that even though I'm sometimes just fed up, I'm angry, I think I listen to what our politicians are saying, and I just want to, my non-violent ethic goes out of the window. I have to somehow renew that vision that this is not the last chapter in the story. And I live with that hope that the God who has promised to make all things new is still working, and he's going to do it in his timetable, not my own.
Helen, how about you? How do we encourage those who feel they've lost hope or they're battle worn?
Yeah, I hearing Philip talk about the despair, lament into hope is such a thing, and the work of Joanna Macy on active hope has really helped me, even though she's, I think, coming from a Buddhist perspective. And James in his story talks about carrying the dirt of despair in your pocket. It doesn't go away. It's there with you. So for me, when I read all these stories, I kept thinking about how we live together in small units, because the structures are so poisonous and so far away and so difficult to intercept. People are so, they've had it with democracy. We don't have a deliberative democracy. So we have to find our voices in those smaller units. There's something about the tenacity of grassroots, the word that we use so often as a throwaway, but the grass does keep coming through. And if we'd stayed longer in Marble Arch, it would have pushed through the tarmac. So there's something about the capacity of the non-human world to resist and persist that we can learn from. I think.
That's really wonderful. Thank you so much. It's just
so beautiful about grass's ability to overcome.
to break through. Yeah.